Hello, Rob G here. We're going to do a little introduction to radial aircraft engines just for fun here. Some of you gearheads out there might be interested in this. So what we're looking at here is a 9-cylinder Curtiss Wright R1820. The R means radial. The 1820 is how many cubic inches it is. This is a 1550 horsepower engine. So on the front here we have a Hamilton standard propeller and a propeller brush block for heated boots on the prop to keep the ice off. This is a gear reduction nose case. They generally turn the prop about a third of the RPM of the engine. The engine RPM max is 3,000. If you get the prop turning any faster or too fast, these big long blades here, the tips will go supersonic, and then the prop loses efficiency and it's real noisy. On the front, on the top here, we have the propeller governor. The pitch on the propeller is regulated by oil pressure, oil from the engine. And this is the harness for the spark plug wires. And then each cylinder has these tubes, that are covering the push rods that go to the valve rocker arms to open and close the valves. And I'll show you here in a little bit how all that operates inside the engine. On this Curtiss Wright, we have one coil per cylinder, but this coil has two spark plug leads. This one goes to the front plug and this one goes to the back plug in each cylinder. So we're firing both spark plugs off of one coil per cylinder. This engine only has one magneto. Most single engine airplanes, we would find two magnetos for redundancy. This was on an airplane that had two engines, so I guess that was their redundancy. Most airplane engines are air cooled, so we have cooling fins. One unique thing on these Curtiss Wrights on the later versions of the engine are these honeycomb baffles. That was something that Curtiss Wright bought a patent from some guy, and these are much more efficient than just cutting cooling fins on your cylinder barrel. Go around to the back here, we'll see the different components. So we have a big 2-barrel pressure carburetor here with 2 Venturis. This has a 1-inch fuel line running to it from the fuel pump that's mounted on the engine over here. So there were 4 of these fuel pumps, identical pumps on the aircraft. 2 of them were on electric boost pumps to boost the fuel up to this pump, and then your engine driven pump pumped it up to the carburetor. This is the magneto, and this harness here goes up to that harness that we saw on the front. These big radials have The starter is in the middle of the accessory case, and there's a clutch to turn the crankshaft. And that clutch is on there. These radial engines, any cylinders that were hanging below horizontal can get oil in them, running past the rings and the valve guides, and hydraulic lock your cylinder. So they had a clutch on there kind of as a last resort backup that's supposed to slip instead of trying to crank the engine and break the rods, bend the rods. We have a big generator here, and this is a hydraulic pump. Underneath we have a vacuum pump. On this aircraft, the vacuum pump was to run the de-ice boots on the wings and tail. The pressure side of the pump inflated the boots to pop the ice off. The vacuum side was used to keep the boots tight against the leading edges during normal flight. We have a oil pump here for the engine. And I'll show you there's one on the front for the nose case. This was a Kuno oil filter in here, and also one in the blower case here. This on this airplane that this engine was off of, it was an S2F tracker made by Grumman in the mid-50s through 60s. It was an anti-submarine plane the Navy had on their carriers. And on the left engine here, they had a great big alternator to run a spotlight, searchlight that was out on the wing. So this is called your accessory section. On the back of the blower case, there's all kinds of gears in there that turn different directions, and that turns the magneto and all these other accessories. They had a wide drive they put down here. There, you could take that off and put one accessory against the engine, or with this wide drive you can run two. They're running a hydraulic pump here and the vacuum pump here off of one drive. So this is the blower section. We have an impeller in there to pressurize the fuel air mixture to get it up to the cylinders. And on the intermediate case here, we have our intake tubes that take the fuel air mixture up to the intake port of the engine. And then here's your exhaust port. The exhaust just was held on there with a clamp. Exhaust on airplanes, not like on a car, they're not airtight. These things have to be able to expand and contract considerably with different temperature. They call them exhaust collectors. They collect the exhaust and get it away from the airframe. And we'll go look at one of these engines that I have in here that's a cutaway. This is a cylinder off one of those 1820 Curtiss Wrights, and I made a little work table to work on it here. This is a piece of an old crankcase. These were steel crankcases coated with copper, and these hold down bolts are what they call a class 4 fit. When you start that bolt in the hole, you can just barely get it started, and you have to turn it in and out of the hole with a wrench. You cannot turn it by hand. The threads are too tight, and you put Permatex on the threads and screw them in there. And like I say, that's class 4 fit. Most aircraft hardware is class 3 fit, and most automotive stuff is class 2. So This has a forged aluminum cylinder head. The barrel here is steel, and this Curtiss-Wright has these honeycomb baffles that are wrapped around it and crimped on there. So here's a crankshaft out of a small radial. This one was a 5-cylinder. All radial engines are going to be odd numbered, either 3, 5, 7, or 9 cylinders. If you have a 14-cylinder radial, it has 2 rows of 7 cylinders. If you have an 18-cylinder, it has 2 rows of 9 cylinders. If you have a 28-cylinder, it has 4 rows of 7. This big heavy rod is called the master rod, and this is the only one that makes a complete revolution with the crankshaft. These other rods are link rods or articulating rods, and as this one goes around in a elliptical or whatever, a circular motion, these go in and out of the cylinders, but you have one master rod on each bank, cylinder bank, and however many articulating rods as your engine has cylinders. The kind of unique thing about how these airplane cylinders are made, this is a steel barrel. They're just basically machined out of big tubing pipe, and they cut the cooling fins in with like a big lathe. And here's your hold down flange with the bolts. There's studs in the case or bolts that go into the engine, whichever the case is for that engine. But we have our cast or forged, whichever type they used, aluminum cylinder head on the steel barrel. So they machined threads on the top of the steel barrel, and they machined threads on the inside of the cylinder head, and they heated the head and chilled the barrel and screwed them together, and that's what holds the cylinder heads on. We have our valve guide here and our valve seat here. There's a spark plug hole with a bushing in it. And this cylinder's off of some old radial, but valve guide here and your rocker arm pivoted in here with a bolt or shaft through it. That's what it looked like on the front. I think these are, well, I don't know what that cylinder's off of, to be honest with you, probably an old Jacobs. Here we're looking at a Pratt Whitney R2800. This is a 18-cylinder engine, 2,800 cubic inches, 2,000 horsepower. This engine would have been in F6F Hellcat, an F4U Corsair, a F8F Bearcat, a P-47 Thunderbolt, several other World War II era fighters, and also multi-engined airplanes. So on the front we have our propeller shaft that has keyways. On some engines there's a master spline. Some engines don't have a master spline that you have to line the prop hub up with. Depends on how the engine's balanced internally. So on this one, here's our magneto, and it has 2 distributors. Here you can see the distributor rotor. Our prop shaft is not connected to the crankshaft. This turns about 1/3 the speed that the crankshaft does. We have large ball bearings in here. And we have planetary gears for our gear reduction. To operate the valves, in here we have cam plates. So these plates have cam lobes on them, and the cam followers ride on that, and that's what opens and closes your valves. There's one set for the intake and one for the exhaust. And then we have a push rod here running up to our rocker arm to open the valve. This is an old Navy cutaway. And here you can see the valve is hollow. The exhaust valves were sodium filled to help dissipate the heat. So this is a master rod, and on this bank we see articulating rods that are hooked to the master rod, and they cut a couple of cylinders out of the way here so we can see it. Here's our intermediate case, blower case is behind it. We have an impeller here that pressurizes the fuel and air mixture, and it goes into these intake tubes up to the cylinders. So this intake tube is going to the rear cylinder, and then it wires off here and it goes up to the front cylinder. That's how the fuel and air get to the intake ports. There was a huge carburetor sitting here, pressure carburetor. And we have another impeller wheel here. I think this was a 2-speed supercharger. Yeah, you could go into high supercharger to go up to higher altitude and still have manifold pressure that you needed for the power. Lots of gearing in here, and then the accessory section on the back. So this thing will run. I'll turn it on. It's pretty noisy. a Curtiss Wright R1820-82 with the proper Hamilton standard propeller on it. There you can see the brush block is in there for the hot prop boots. It takes electric current. There's carbon brushes and a slip rings on the back of the prop hub, and it goes down this wire to this heated boot that's on the prop to keep the ice off. This boot's just glued to the prop, and that's on there to keep the ice from forming. If you get ice on the blades and you sling it off of one, it can go out of balance and tear the prop off or tear the engine off the plane, so you had to keep the ice from forming. On this propeller, from here up to the hub, they shot peened it with metal steel balls to harden it up there. If you do any repairs in that area, you have to re-shot peen it, or they got a special little hammer you peck on it to make it look like the same thing. Here's the data plate. Lycoming engine. Lycoming built a bunch of engines over the years. This was built under license. It is a Curtiss Wright design, but Lycoming built these engines. This 1820 is the same engine family that was in the B-17 during World War II. They did not have these kind of fins on them. They had regular fins cut into the barrels, and those engines were a lot less horsepower. This is a 1550 horsepower engine. So on this engine mount, it was held to the firewall with 4 bolts. Here we see our fuel filter. This is the oil cooler. The oil cooler has a thermostat on it, and the oil line's running up to the 12-gallon oil tank. The oil in these air-cooled engines is twice as thick as the oil you run in your automobile. So it's like 60 weight oil. Or anyhow, when the oil's cold, it bypasses the cooler. When it gets warm, it opens this thermostat and it goes to the aluminum oil cooler. This is a oil filter. And we have cowling flaps that we open on the ground, especially to keep more air flowing over the cylinders, keep the engine cool. In flight, you can close those. Then there's our fuel boost pump, and we'll go around to the other side. So over here on the right side, you can see the magneto up there on the engine, and there's the induction vibrator that's hooked to the starter that helps shower of sparks whenever you want to start it. This is an oil dilution valve. On these old planes, if they wanted to start them in a cold environment below freezing, the oil was too thick to crank the engine. So what they did is, at the last flight of the day, before they shut down, you open that valve on the ground and pump gasoline into the oil tank, and it mixed with the oil and thinned it out, and then you shut it down, and when you came out the next day or whatever, the oil was thin enough you could crank the engine and get it started. And so you sat there at idle till it evaporated enough gas out of the oil to get your oil pressure up, to where you could take off. Kind of crude, but that's what they had. Then on a smaller scale, here's a brand new 3600cc radial engine made in Australia. It's got a little nose case gear reduction on it. This is a 9-cylinder. People put these in experimental airplanes, and I've seen a lot of them in chopper motorcycles. If you look that up, it's kind of cool. I'm putting this in a GB R1 replica. Building it from scratch. It's a wooden airplane. I'm just building it out of plywood and pine from the hardware store. This will not be a flyer. It's for ground run only, for recruiting purposes, to get students interested in aviation, to take around to events. There's Jimmy Doolittle with the R1 back in 1932. He just set a world speed record, 296 miles an hour. He was the fastest man on the planet. And if you don't know who Jimmy Doolittle was, it's worth looking that one up, because he did a lot of interesting things, especially in aviation. He was a real pioneer, the first guy to take off and land strictly on instruments, not looking out of the cockpit, and he, I believe, designed and built a lot of those instruments himself. Yeah, I mounted it on a Volvo truck just for fun.